table, this panel with Michael Parker from the University of Oxford. And we also have here Luz Saavedra from Spain, from Médecins Sans Frontières, and also Victoria Sagans, World Vision International from Armenia, right? Luz, please.
Hi, dear colleagues. I am very grateful to be here. I was thinking of the ways I'm going to incorporate all the fantastic exchanges we're having, because today I'm going to be partly presenting preliminary results of an ongoing research I'm leading on with Doctors Without Borders. So that's going to be interesting. So thank you to our Ghanaian host and the World Health Organization for this opportunity. Come with me for 1 second to 2011. At the time, I was Deputy Emergency Coordinator in what at the time was one of the worst famines in the Horn of Africa. I said at the time because with climate change and the combinations, it seems that the superlatives were running out of them. So there we were in Doloado. For those that don't know, it's in that triangle between Kenya, Somalia, and Ethiopia, literally chasing semi-nomadic people to ask them questions to prepare our response. There we were, and there's this older lady, incidentally favorite key informants, and the lady said to me, "You look like a nice lady. Come here and I will help you. Stop asking stupid questions of how many goats we have and start asking whether I have a cousin in Calgary or not." Well, she was very nice to help me. But this little story, I think, brings us to 3 essential components. One, that is at the heart of our ethical challenges quest. What are the right questions? But also, and it has been mentioned quite a lot, which are the voices that are heard of? And very importantly, during emergencies, there is community overload. So acting ethically and responsibly also means not making people lose their time with our own priorities. As the US writer Rebecca Solnit says, and this has been alluded before, credibility in our world is a survival tool. So let's go. Equity in collaborative research partnerships in humanitarian settings, I think, is perceived as imperative, while the practice of the implementation of it, it's a bit more shaky. It's a bit like the concept of humanitarian. It's a simple idea in its conception, alleviate suffering, save lives, be respectful, but the implementation, and now I put my emergency coordinator hat, is very much more another story and complicated. So I think that we need to acknowledge as well that there has been a lot of progress in the growing availability of ethically centered guidance. I have to, at this point, allude at the recognition as a key dimension of equity. This research, we didn't bring it to the MSF Ethics Review Board, but to the colleagues of Cambridge. That made me sweat, but definitely made me have a better proposal. So thank you, Asante Sana. Ethically centered guidance. However, there persists in MSF, and I think we are not alone, a strong perception that fair collaborative partnerships are neglected and often poorly documented in practice. So an emergency means that everything is exacerbated and accelerated. So humanitarian adaptation, yes. But if I have to ask you to come out with one concept of my presentation would be, we cannot, we should not, and as I'm going to demonstrate, is not necessarily impossible, that emergency, the urgency, the pressure, the uncertainty cannot be a one-size-fits-all excuse not to do things ethically. Perhaps the follow-up of that key message would be we need to be flexible in the process and adaptative, but also firm on the principles. because humanitarian settings, and particularly emergencies, Gustavo was alluding it, is not necessarily something that is consensually agreed by everyone. So in emergencies, having been at the receiving end of parachute extractive research when I was coordinating teams, it's always a nuisance and something that is diverting us from our goal. But in emergencies, it can even become something where we actively do harm because we are deviating the focus from the humanitarian imperative to save lives and alleviate suffering. So finding that balance, it's really, really the key of the discussions that I have with my teams, not as a researcher, as a manager, yeah? Feasibility issues, as I was saying, they are exacerbated because there's competing priorities, because things always evolve faster than you can catch up, because you need to take decisions that are going to be impactful, but at the same time are going to be decisions that not only are going to have an impact, but you perhaps would like to have more time to have yet another consultation or to check balances with other actors and so forth. But this is not necessarily happening in an emergency. Here again, I quote another writer, Maya Angelou. And we were talking about this in the breakup groups before. People forget what you say and even what you do, but people never forget how you make them feel. And I think that there's on this tacit, more intangible, more difficult to measure elements where a lot of the ethical way to do collaborative research partnerships come from. And Gustavo was alluding to them, and I know that my colleague Victoria is also going to talk about it. In an emergency, the exacerbation of conditions is what is putting us in front of issues of feasibility, whether we like it or not. However, and you were alluding to this, Gustavo, emergency according to whom? What is the emergency? As a humanitarian international organization representative, sometimes, if there's no an official declaration, you cannot simply impose your view. I have worked in countries where cholera doesn't exist, it's always acute watery diarrhea. We have seen it with famine. I think in the nutritional field, it's very clear, you know, you have the early warnings and so forth, but if those early warnings don't lead to an effective action, what are we talking about, yeah? The declaration of famine is always something that political and other interests get on the way. So we need to take into account this because the official declaration can be controversial on one sense or the other. Acting responsibly while we are under the pressure of time and uncertainty can be complex in that sense. And this is why for the quantitative and qualitative part of the research that Kenfrey so gladly reviewed, we have used the analytical framework of the MSF ERB. In one way, it's at the origin of trying to be adaptative, and I think if you read an article that Anna shared with me about the origin of the ERB in MSF and how it has evolved, the adaptativeness of humanitarian, we have the author here. The adaptiveness, how they have been adapting the way that at the end of the day, they ask questions around what is the context of your research and how this context has influenced your design and the way that you're going to do your methods and so forth. Ethical in humanitarian medicine can be related to these complex matters where benchmarks often fail to say, we were talking about how polemic can be an emergency. I have personally worked in protracted urban contexts where all the sphere standards are overpassed, but that's not considered an emergency necessarily, no? So we focus on trying to articulate the values that ethical considerations can be taken with regards to this context of uncertainty and pressure. How these complex matters can nuance the relevant thinking that we are putting in terms of how this research is being done. But elements around significant participation, proper consultations. The evidence pathway has been documented and is accessible to everyone. And the ERB has even done their own work in terms of adapting to emergencies with pre-approval of emergency protocols that are specifically used assessing tools that they have created. I think it's fascinating, and I'm happy to take questions on that at a later stage. I have 2 more slides. So for this conference, what I have done is that from the 177 studies between 2018 and 2023 that we are looking at with the team, have purposefully selected 17 projects that were specifically run in collaborative partnerships under pressure. Can you see? Yeah, it was black there, sorry. That were under the pressure of an emergency. You can see on this side of the slide the location, the geographical location. You cannot really see it because it's too small, but Haiti was there as well. And the number of countries that were involved. So clearly the most emergency collaborative research partnerships that I included in this small sample was Congo, followed by Nigeria. And on the left, your right side of the screen, you can see the three top scoring projects. One in Democratic Republic of Congo, it was evaluating the effectiveness of measles vaccine. Sometimes when I am on the Monday turn around the world, MSF, where we talk about what we are doing and how we are doing, I have the impression that we are MSF is not Médecins Sans Frontières, but Measles Without Borders, because the outbreaks are everywhere and constantly. So this was, from the sense of relevancy, a very interesting research. Another one in Nigeria related to hemorrhagic epidemic that is not Ebola. It's written there, Lassa fever. That again was a field evaluation of validity and feasibility. And a third one in Guinea, Conakry, related to what happens with the second dosage of cholera vaccine when you are late, because this is what happens when we are in emergencies. We plan for something, but the uncertainty and the pressure for time often comes very quickly. I think that the ethical challenges should not either be an excuse for us to become risk averse. And as these projects demonstrate, it is possible to be in a situation where you do things ethically despite of the emergency conditions, as these three projects show, and I'm happy to explain a bit more. Incidentally, the three of them were led by female PIs. I leave it there. It's preliminary. Maybe I'm going to be changing things later. So a final reflection. Up. I think we are exacto. It's uncertainty and it doesn't pass. There you go. Here we are. So summing up, an emergency is an accelerator and an exacerbator of the ethical problems that we anyway have in the humanitarian settings and others when it comes to health research partnerships. However, it's important that we challenge the myths and that the emergency culture, as I said before, cannot be a shield against scrutiny and doing things properly since inception. As the top studies demonstrate, it's beneficial to have this ethical approach, and it's feasible. And why these projects were so good? They were good because they closed the loop. They were good because they were able to demonstrate and document the significant and clear roles of majority countries, institutions and researchers that were involved. They were transparent in the mutual accountability processes, and they were very explicit about, and we alluded to this before, they were explicit about the challenges, they were explicit about the risks, they were explicit about where they found unsolvable things and put good ethical questions forward. At a time when racism and inequalities have been for quite a sustained time at the top of the discussions in our sector, be it because of Black Lives Matter and all the consequences that through the world, or the COVID-19 vaccine apartheid, as the head of the World Health Organization qualified. I cannot imagine how much evidence that man had to be able to say that in public. And let's not forget the Palestinian genocide. Whether your approach to ethical research partnerships, it's practical or it's instrumental or it's really ethically guided, what is clear is that when we're having discussions about quality, we cannot leave ethics out of the picture. I was saying before, the top studies demonstrate that yes, it is possible, yes, it is feasible. As our Che Guevara used to say, let's be realistic, let's do the impossible. Or even better, because we didn't know it was impossible, we did it. And I would like to say that equity and ethics is at the heart of quality research and collaborative partnerships, partly as well because perhaps we were discussing all this in the breakup table. Perhaps equity is not something that we can achieve, and perhaps we don't want to be equal. But as the great poet Benedetti says, I would say that equity would be a bit like utopia. It's the thing that helps us keep on moving towards an horizon of better made, because as it has been said many times, the focus here, let's not forget, is to be able to contribute to improve people's lives and health. Thank you so much. I'm on time? I'm good?
Can you help me with which, like, what are the slides? From forward?
Yeah?
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm the last presenter for today, and that's good news. And it's my pleasure to be in this important event. This is my first ever effort to participate in this platform. And I'm coming from a child-focused organization, World Vision, that mostly operates in low... Can you hear me? I cannot hear myself. Hello? Hello? Okay, yeah. Thank you so much. So as I mentioned, we work in low and middle income countries, including the emergency humanitarian contexts. And I'm coming with more than 25 years of working experience from over 40 countries and conducting the design, implementation, evaluation of these efforts, because we want to know whether what we are doing is making the change at the most vulnerable. This conference actually made me think a little bit differently. What is ethics in research? Although I was part of in many research efforts. And we already mentioned a lot that ethics belongs to everyone. It's the families, the children, the communities, the researchers, funders. However, whose ethics count? It depends on who hold the power to define what is ethical. Let's imagine the situation in the community where we are delivering a parenting program, and the frontline staff is supposed to deliver the parenting program, and in the midst of that implementation, they are supposed to also collect high-quality data, because we included the research element, evidence-building element into that effort. So facilitators receive new monitoring tools, and however, there is very limited time to invest into training them or simplifying, making it appropriate for their use. But expectations remain high. Yeah, we're expecting high quality data, and yet the supervision is limited. And in such contexts, monitoring is less about learning than more about compliance and checking or completing the checklists. This is the real case from Rwanda, which is called Care and Comfort for Children, the research study that we carried out in Rwanda in 3 particular camp communities, Mugomba, Kikembe, and Kenzi, and where we were delivering the responsive caregiving, nurturing, parenting program package for children with under 5-age children. Caregivers, sorry. And we trained the frontline staff, and including the local staff. And I was assigned as the technical lead for the project, including the research. And everything was done remotely, because that was COVID time. We started at the end of 2020 and finished the beginning of 2023. So including the training, including the weekly catch-ups or action planning or monthly reports, everything happening virtually. Let me start with the positive thing. We were testing 2 parenting programs, and one with high intensity, the other one is low intensity, and we're comparing the results with the control group in terms of the change at parenting practices, particularly responsive feeding and interaction, early learning activities. And we found significant improvements and changes, though not at child level. The implementation was only 6 months. And another surprising thing, we didn't even detect any significant change between the 2 intervention arms, the high and low intensity programs. This study, by the way, is also published. But what is behind these positive outcomes, and whose labor and emotions carried the weight? We trained the frontline staff, and who were refugees themselves. Yeah, so we trained facilitators and also mentors to carry out group sessions, home visits that also include individual counseling. They are supposed to also do the referrals and follow-ups, and also completing their weekly, their monthly action plans. And also the mentors, in addition to that, also completing the monitoring forms for fidelity, for quality of the implementation. We know that all of these are really important. Yeah, monitoring of implementation makes or brings the message, like why or why not we didn't make an impact. But however, all of these efforts are coming for just $55 per facilitator, so it's really a small amount. And we also held the group reflection meetings. You can see the photo from group reflection, and that was probably the only space where facilitators should raise their voices about the realities. But we can ask the question what they get in return. So ethics in the field are lived every day, yeah? And after the evaluation, one of the facilitators were saying that sometimes we know what to do, but I'm not in the capacity to do it due to constraints. And because there were a lot of moral distress and emotional pressure, and during today's afternoon presentation, Stella and Sasi were speaking about these aspects, and this comes in the form of heavy workload, sometimes unrealistic targets that we put. Maybe there was no enough proper workload analysis, and what we are asking for the people on the ground to deliver. The refugees themselves who were facing all of this struggle, they were also supposed to care for their peer families and who were witnessing the same challenges, such as violence or abusive or limited access to resources or services, while there are also limited services available. So they are also carrying all that burden of powerlessness. Some of them also engaged in multiple projects as income or livelihood opportunities, overstretching their abilities. And when it comes with operational gaps and which is combined with the culture of hiding the challenge or not speaking about the ground realities, this speaks about the systemic issues. Yeah, it's not about individual power. When protocols meet the reality, we must ask whose realities they meet. And often we know that institutional ethics are in the form of protocols or IRBs are overweighting the ethics or lived realities of the frontline staff on the ground. And this can come in the form of, for example, constant under pressure, when it's not really a truly voluntarily consent, because the frontline staff is accepting these kind of offers because they are afraid of maybe missing other aid opportunities, or sometimes the local actors, camp communities were offering or selecting the frontline staff. And this consent was taken in front of the authorities. So they also do not have that safe space to refuse. And also this underreporting, which is, as I said, is about the fear of reporting about the challenges. What we found at the final evaluation that over 55% of eligible families who were supposed to receive home visits, they didn't receive home visits. It speaks, again, not about the failure of the front line, but it's about feasibility. Is it appropriate to the context? Is it appropriate, or are they really overstretched? Are we putting those realistic work plans for the staff to deliver? And interestingly, we documented that during the implementation, there was not even one single withdrawal from the project of the frontline staff. And we're saying, oh, these are great results. But this made me think a little bit differently. Maybe this is about, maybe this is a red flag that we didn't have even one such case. And in true ethics, these both realities should be in balance, the institutional and frontline. Let's pause and rethink ethics not only as a form of rules and relationships, yeah, or protocols. And when people feel they matter, yeah, they feel they are valued, they are important, they are bringing contribution, then there is a higher chance that they can act with empathy, with care, with trust. And however, this is all about relationships, yeah, personal relationships. And this kind of ethics takes time to build those trustful relationships. But sometimes the system is rushing for quick results. And therefore, we need to create those appropriate systems or mechanisms that allow care and not only compliance. In the Newfield concept, ethics, no, it's still okay. It reminds us that ethics is more than protocols. This is about shared responsibility. It's about the trust. It's about the fairness. And however, sometimes the change should start from the most powerful. And we're discussing around the table who should count or be responsible for that. Yeah, the funders, for example, that bring the budget or the funds to specific projects, how much they are engaging with the communities in the co-design. Yeah, maybe the ECD parenting program, not the most important. Maybe something else was more relevant and urgent to meet their needs. And also, as I mentioned, it's not only about data collection but also about the shared responsibilities. Together with the communities. Now we go to 3 recommendations based on what we discussed. The first one is about creating that enabling creating the enabling environment to align with the expectations with the ground realities, and which comes in the form of enough time being spent for the frontline staff to understand and map the workload, and understand their abilities, budget enough for their fair inputs and workload that we are assigning, and also provide that support for their well-being, because they are also the caregivers themselves that carry the burden, or maybe the double burden of them and also other community members. And this, for example, can come in the form of even together revising the content or simplifying the tools that can make their work more easier. The second recommendation is about refining the workforce engagement. This was also discussed because the frontline or the local team, they are the experts of their context. They know what works for them. They are knowledgeable, but how much we are engaging them into the decision making. And we need to have, and actually in many contexts, we always ensure that there is advisory group where the workforce together with the communities and also the researchers, they come together to adapt, to make them feasible and appropriate on the context. And also, most important, we need to recognize, reward and respect. We need to have those mechanisms and systems in place to acknowledge, because sometimes these kind of aspects, this emotional support matters more than only the monetary support, reward. And the third recommendation is anticipate ethics in practice. Maybe this is too simplistic, this ethic preparedness checklist, but it's not only about the checklist, it's about how to operationalize every aspect, how to ensure that consent is taken in a way that it is done in a safe way, or safeguarding, or referral aspects, or data security aspects. I put a question about the IRBs. Yes, is IRB the only mechanism, or is it enough, or should it have some other aspects or context or domains when it comes to the conducting research in crisis context? And the final closing message is that ethical partnerships belong to everyone. Oh, it's not going back. Oh, it's here, sorry. It's not add-on. They are the foundation of credible research. And especially in this partnership, it's most important that we hear the voice of the least powerful. And in spite of all the challenges that I listed, we brought a lot of hope. The final evaluation and especially the qualitative part, when we are hearing what communities, what the families, what parents or frontline staff were saying, we feel that we brought that kind of hope, and they are valued, and their problems are seen, and we're trying to address those challenges together. Thank you for your attention and your patience. Yeah. Oops. This one is still working.
Thank you very much, Victoria. It was a very exciting presentation from Luz and Victoria. I would like to invite Mike Parker, yes, to do some remarks on ethical reflection on the current presentations.
Thanks very much. We've just had three great presentations, and in some ways I think it'd be better just to go to the groups rather than have me say something. But I've been asked to say a few words, so I will. I'll try and say a couple of things that I think hopefully will be new, and I'll also try to make a link between this and the group work as much as possible. So I think one of the things that it's really important to think about is that we've got a tendency, and I include myself in this, to talk about other people's collaborations rather than talking about our own. And so there'll be people in the room who are running collaborations or have some kind of leadership role in the collaboration. So myself, together with Peikyong and Sassy in the room, we've been running for the last between 15 years, I think, nearly, the Global Health Bioethics Network, which is a collaboration which has many of the features of a scientific collaboration. It's funded by Wellcome, it has partners all around the world, and raises many of the same kind of issues. So, you know, we could just as easily be asking some of these questions about our own work. And I think GFBR is a good example, as is Glide. So I think, you know, maybe when there's a report, as it were, from this meeting, I think it'll be useful to have some element of that, which says actually what lessons might we learn from these discussions about our own practice. And I think that could be quite interesting. One of the things that's apparent from the discussion already is that research collaborations around the world and in individual countries and in regions and even within institutions are nearly always imperfect. So there are always things that could have been done better from an ethical perspective. There are always ways in which we fall short, and that's kind of inevitable. And obviously the aim here is to try to raise ethical standards and to make things better. But I think we have to acknowledge that the world is imperfect, world of research collaboration. And I think it's important to ask that question: what does the imperfection of collaboration and the challenges mean for what is reasonable to expect? And so I tend to start, when I'm thinking about ethics, one of the places I start from is questions of responsibility. So, you know, what are the relevant relationships here? Who are the key stakeholders? And what might it be reasonable to say about the responsibilities that they have? And I think, you know, Victoria's the slide previous to the last one, where, you know, the relationship between expectations and reality, I think, is important in this context too. So I think you can only say someone has an obligation to do something scientifically or ethically if it's possible for them to do that. If there are constraints on them which make it impossible, we can't expect them to fulfill that obligation or even see them as having that kind of obligation. So I think it's really important that, for example, those frontline workers, there are limits on what we say about their obligations, because there are all sorts of constraints on their practice, which I think is really important. But of course, so far I've been talking about relationships in collaborations in general and bioethics collaborations, but the purpose of this session is to focus much more narrowly on what are the questions that arise in relation to the ethics of collaboration in the context of emergencies. So that raises the question about what, if anything, is special about an emergency from an ethical perspective, and to some extent that raises questions about what it's reasonable to expect of someone, what are the limitations, what's the nature and scope of their obligations in the context of an emergency. And I think questions we're going to have to ask ourselves in the discussion groups is, to what extent are those different from other kinds of collaborations? I think picking up on a point that Carla made earlier, I think there are very strong reasons for doing research in the context of an emergency. We have obligations to future generations. We want to make it sure that next time people have to engage with a global health emergency, that they're better prepared than we were. That might mean better treatments, better diagnoses, better non-pharmaceutical interventions, better forms of data sharing, whatever it is. And the only way that that's going to happen is if we learn lessons from the emergencies that we're currently in. So it seems to me there's a very strong obligation to conduct research in these contexts. But emergencies are what we called in the Nuffield report radically non-ideal contexts for doing research, and they raise all sorts of questions. But one of the things I think it's quite interesting is whether there's whether it's a binary, as it were, a jump from what it's like to do research in peace times, and what it's like to do research in an emergency, or whether it's a kind of continuum. So if we think about what is it that happens during an emergency that is relevant to this discussion, one of the things is that there's a huge amount of disruption. Okay, so things are not as they usually are, trying to avoid the normal times that Gustavo highlighted. There's a very significant health need, and that's very pressing. There's a time pressure. But I think many of you would say, well, in research, that's just like normal times to some extent. There are great health needs, there's disruption, there is time pressure. So what's different about an emergency? Is it the degree of that, or is there a point at which something becomes ethically different in significant ways? There's a huge amount of uncertainty in the context of an emergency, and there's a lot of distress and emotional dimensions, as we've heard both from Sassi earlier and from Victoria just now. So this raises, I think, a really interesting set of questions about, well, without defining emergency, I think we have a sense of the kind of things that go to helping us to identify emergency when we see one. But to what extent do those justify morally significant differences between those two contexts? I think the other thing we've learned today, particularly from both of the presentations and the talks more generally today, is that I think we need to think about partnerships in a much more expanded kind of way than we have been. So I think coming into this meeting, I certainly was thinking about partnerships as partnerships between research institutions in high-income countries or lower middle-income countries, or researchers in high-income countries and researchers in low-middle-income countries. But we've seen that a research initiative is essentially a kind of ecosystem of collaborations and partnerships. And I think we need to take that into account when we're thinking about these things. And it's important that we're not too narrow in our understanding of what is a partnership and what is a relationship that matters. And all of those relationships and partnerships are bringing together institutions, people in different roles, all of whom have different values, or many of them will have different values, competing interests, competing commitments, which rub up against each other in a whole range of different ways that need to be addressed. And so that makes, I think, research partnership a really interesting and complex, wicked problem, for want of a better word. Now, I did some research a few years ago, and I was involved in a big research collaboration, a scientific research collaboration, and I was looking for something that I could do as a research project. And as a kind of sideline, I decided what it would be good to do would be to interview researchers in Africa and Southeast Asia primarily, about what they thought was the difference between a good and a bad research collaboration. And I amazingly got ethics approval for that study, and it was a study with one question. So I just interviewed people and I said, what's the difference between what's the difference between a good and bad collaboration? And we published that paper. I did the analysis with Patricia Kenguri. And they said several things. They said, active involvement in research, effective leadership, commitment to good scientific practice across the network, capacity building, respect for needs and the interests of all partners, opportunities for discussion and disagreement, trust and confidence, justice and fairness in collaboration. Now, what's striking to me now, and I thought that was a nice study at the time, and I thought it was interesting, but what's striking about it is that none of those researchers mentioned the vast majority of the things we've been talking about today. So they didn't talk about, for example, frontline staff. They didn't talk about relationships with communities. So I think that's striking. Then what it suggests is that if we're going to do further research into what constitutes a fair collaboration, we need to be careful about who we speak to. And that's why I think these two studies are particularly important, actually, because they give really interesting insights. But there's clearly a lot of nuance here and a lot of complexity that we need to think in very sophisticated ways about understanding. And that has important ethical connotations, I think, too. So the question that we've got for our group work is, to what extent and in what ways ought the standard view of ethics in research, global health research collaborations, be different, if at all, when we're talking about, or might need to be modified in ways, when we're talking about research in emergencies, an emergency context, or humanitarian. And I agree with Gustavo, really there's often not much of a distinction between those two things. So that's the question we're left with. And it strikes me that there might be some interesting and counterintuitive things coming out of that discussion. So one might be, we might actually say that it's more important that we do good quality community engagement in an emergency for a whole range of reasons. But that's kind of in tension with the idea that it's incredibly difficult, and even more difficult in the context of an emergency than it is elsewhere. So in some aspects of these partnerships, we might expect higher standards, but it'd be more difficult to achieve them. And I think that raises the question about what is it reasonable to expect and what kind of obligations are generated by these kind of contexts and in relation to the kind of things we're hoping to achieve. What, for example, is it reasonable to expect of a frontline worker? What is it reasonable to expect of a community? It seems reasonable to us to expect something, but what? And I think these things, I have to say, I don't really have an answer to. So what do high standards of partnership in research collaborations in emergencies mean? What does that require? So I think that's a discussion. And I think the point that Victoria made, one of the last slides, about this relationship between expectations and reality seems incredibly important. It seems there's a real risk of expecting too much in a context where it's really very difficult, and that ends up potentially demonizing is too strong, but we could end up criticizing people who are trying to do the best they can and for not having reached some kind of ideal standard. On the other hand, I think it could potentially mean we don't ask enough and that we are too undemanding of the collaborations that are generated and are necessary in research emergencies. So I think this question of how do we think about the relationship between expectations and reality and what happens when they come into conflict with each other is really complicated. And my guess is it can't be answered in theory. It has to be answered in practice, and who's going to be doing that answering, I think, is a key question. So I will stop there. No idea how long I spoke for, 11 minutes. And I'll hand back to Gustavo. Okay.
Well, wonderful. So we have many good questions. Catherine, we have more 10 minutes. It's 10 minutes, okay? So we will open for questions for 10 minutes. Yeah, that's the first one.
Hi, I'm Pamela from the Philippines. We had just come from a Category 5 typhoon last week. 3 days before that, another typhoon. The week before that, typhoon plus earthquake 5.9 magnitude. So from where I stand, one common observation among us in the Philippines is that when we see an image, when we see a call for donations, we cannot anymore attribute the specific emergency or disaster because they just keep coming and coming and coming. So my question is, the way things are unfolding in the world right now, are we headed towards a future where we will no longer have the luxury of calling something an emergency because of the frequency with what they happen? And if so, what are the implications of that for collaboration and for collaboration specifically for research?
I have an idea to have 3 questions and then come back to the presenters. Okay, this one and that one.
After 9/11, there was a sort of statement, guidelines from USA saying disaster research and ethics is no different from any other situation. We actually challenged that because post-tsunami, there's a lot of things. So we convened a regional meeting funded by the Wellcome Trust, and we came to the consensus that by definition, low and middle income countries and resource poor settings are necessarily vulnerable. So where do you stand in that? Is research ethics post-disaster is not different from ordinary research conducted in resource poor settings? That's my question.
Yeah, yep. Next.
Thank you so much. My question is for both the presenters, Luz and Victoria. Thank you so much for presenting the cases about ethical research in the communities. But I was wondering if you could comment on when funders and big, donors, those who fund for these projects, themselves engage with the community and collect data and do research in a way that might not appear ethical in the way you presented. What is the role of institutions like World Vision and MSF and others to stand up and represent the community and say, maybe push back the donors, knowing that the donors have the power in those emergencies, and we need resource for those emergencies, and the resource are the donors. So thank you so much.
Yep. One more. We already have 3. Pei Young.
Thank you very much. So I've been struggling the whole day with the word equitable, equal, and then Victoria said ethical partnership. What are we after, actually? Is it ethical partnership, equal partnership, or equitable partnership? And which, yeah.
Difference.
What's, thank you.
Good. Well, we will have a round here. So I will pass to Luz first, and then Victoria and Mike.
Thank you. Thank you for great questions. Indeed, to the colleagues from Philippines, I'm also wondering the same in terms of emergencies nonstop. 5 years ago, I had the opportunity to lead a research when we were looking at the impact of counterterrorism measures in the provision of impartial healthcare. And we on purpose selected Iraq, Afghanistan, and Nigeria as extreme examples of the challenges we have been seeing today. Many colleagues in headquarters were very surprised because on purpose, the core of that research was what MSF frontline workers are experiencing in these 3 countries. And a lot of people in HQ were surprised, maybe is not the right word, but similar, how much the frontline workers were talking about the importance of humanitarian principles and going back to the essentials. So I know it's not an answer that helps 100%, but when you're lost, go back to the basics and the essentials. And I think that often when we talk about humanitarian principles, the principle of humanity, and the quote I was doing about Maya Angelou, people never forget how you make them feel, is very essential. And I say this knowing that our sector relies excessively in quantification, so I'm going to be an activist for qualitative, non-measurable, essential things in that sense. Shall I pass? We go question by question, right? And I don't know, yeah.
I think that we need to respond to all the questions.
Yeah. With regards to the funders' role, excellent question. Doctors Without Borders, MSF, is an organization that has more than 10 million people that give money to us so that we can do our work. So it doesn't matter whether I'm being the PI of this research or the emergency coordinator in Jenin like last year. Often I push my teams to say, vamos a ver, we don't have to go chasing the money, reporting, auditing, and so forth. Therefore, our work should be of top quality or increased quality. So the donors sometimes have a role in the sense of being the external factor that pushes changes that otherwise would not necessarily happen. And I think I'm going to pass the mic. I think we were talking about difference of emergency, non-emergency. I think, sir, it's no difference in terms of the principles. It's much more the adaptativeness of the application of how you put them into place. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the questions. And yes, we work and we also have World Vision in Philippines, and on a daily basis we're receiving these notices about the emergency, and organization-wise we're trying to build in the M&E processes, including evidence building through the systems and approaches that are business as usual. It's not add-on. Yeah, it's part of that. It's really helping to build the knowledge and whether what we are doing is changing the life of the communities. But yes, I agree that in some contexts, it's especially on emergency onset, it's terrible. We're trying to do our research efforts when it's more in protracted crisis, where it's more or less a stable situation, but which is still challenging. And I would say yes, the degree of challenges are different, though the same domains in emergency versus in development context. But there are some, for example, when it comes to the time pressure, yeah, the rapid cycles is one issue. The aid research mess I would say sometimes the organizations are associated with the aid. For example, when it's UN, it's about money, that it will come, or yeah, the expectation from the organizations is more kind of tangible rather than soft. For example, we come as with these parenting interventions. And an emergency, especially the data security is really a challenge, because when you work in the communities, and this is about camp community, for example, a small community, the confidentiality is an issue. So these kind of things are the nuances that we need to consider, and also the governing. There are multiple levels of governing governors. Yeah, you work at the camp, then you go to another level, then UN, then within our organization with the government. So it's multi-level efforts which are complicating. In regards to the funding, actually, the research that in Rwanda that we brought, actually the funder, the BPRM at that time, was not, they didn't include research, but it was through our internal research funding that we're fortunate to have to build in that, or build on that project, that the research component element, because we want to know if, let's say, the parenting program that we do in developing context, whether it has the same impact, or the operational cycles, the dosage, the intensity. These are the questions that globally are having question marks, and we want to prove the concepts that we have. Yeah.
I'll try and give three brief answers. In relation to the first one, I think seeing situations where continuously really difficult problem caused by event like the ones you described, or whether you have a humanitarian crisis. There's a bit of a tendency in these conversations to think that if something's called an emergency, it's somehow morally more important. And so my response to that would be to say, let's not get too, I mean, obviously I realize that a declaration of emergency releases certain kind of resources, etc., that matters in that sense. But morally, I think, you know, these other situations matter. Whether we call them an emergency or not, essentially doesn't matter at a moral level. It may be important, but I would, because something happens a lot or it's been there a long time, I don't think that makes it any less kind of urgent, as it were. In relation to whether emergencies are morally different from non-emergencies, so I think it's very easy to say the principles of, you know, for me, it would be very easy to say the principles are the same, the situation is different. I guess it would also probably be quite easy to say, no, they're very different. But I think if I approach to ethics, I think the key question is, what kind of relationships what kind of relationships arise in those situations? What is it about the context that generates important moral responsibilities and obligations? And my sense is, actually, if you think of it that way, there may well be a case for saying that not only are emergencies different from non-emergencies, they're often different from each other. You know, so I think I would not want to hang this too much on principles. I'd want to say, let's look at the particulars of the situation and be prepared to engage with those ethical questions. That was that. Kyung, I know you weren't asking for a definition, but I'll say what I think, and then. So, you know, the way I think of it is that, you know, equality has something to do with treating people the same, which I'll come back to. And equity means that it might sometimes be appropriate to treat people differently because of some relevant characteristic. So I think those both might be relevant here. So, for example, I think equality matters when we're talking about treating people with moral respect. You know, I think everyone involved, participants, communities, should be treated with equal moral respect. So that's where equality matters to me, or one place. Another, where equity matters, is I do think that there will be situations in which it's not only allowable to treat people differently, as in provide resources in different ways, but it may also be morally required to treat people differently. So treating people equally may be wrong in many situations. So and the ethics is the overarching kind of what's the right thing to do about all of that.
Thank you very much, everyone. So we are on time, but I would like to comment something about Pei Young question. It's not a question, just to reflect with you. So this is something that I really think that in terms of ethical discussion, we need to do. It's like a Wittgenstein statement. So don't ask about the meaning, but ask about the use. For instance, how we are using equity in terms of global health and in humanitarian settings and health emergencies. I think that morally, I think that is really, really important in how we can face some cynic discourses, right? I think that the word is too heavy, but I think that is the more meaningful proposal, right? So thank you very much, everyone. I think that we had a very good discussion, and now we will divide to the group discussions.